Tanks are known as the military's best land-based vehicles for combat, as they're big, strong, and have heavy firepower. Tanks have majorly evolved over the decades with new armor, weaponry, and mobility. But the question is, are World War II tanks better than modern tanks? Well, to find that out, first we need to go back to World War I to see the first tank and where they came from. As it's the second year into the Battle of World War I, and the UK needs something with heavy armor and firepower to ward off the Germans and make the Kaiser mad. So, in 1915, Foster of Lincoln made the Little Willie tank. But the thing is, only one was ever built, and the tiny tank never saw combat, so it was preserved in a museum. But the tank idea would live on as the next tank was built in 1916. It was the British Mark I tank. The tank had no main turret on it but had treads fully wrapped around the tank. The tank had mini-guns on the top and both sides, but the tank had no main cannon. The tank could travel at basically walking speed, only going at 3 miles an hour. The Mark I was so slow that enemy troops could take it over easily and kill the crew. And the armor was basically thin metal sheets. Though the Mark I was first deployed in combat on September 15, 1916, 49 Mark I tanks were created and most of the tanks wouldn't even start when deployed. But the UK kept making prototype variants until the Mark IV in 1917. Still incredibly slow at only 5 miles an hour, the speed changes nothing from the Mark I. But this tank had better armor with actual thick plates. And on the side, the turrets on it were armored, and with way better weaponry on the tank. The Mark IV was deployed in 1917, it was a good tank. With way better armor and weapons, it did okay. But now the war is over, and tanks won't have to be used until over 20 years later. Now it's World War II and the Third Reich is on the rise. So the Allies are thinking, what can we use to defend off the Germans? And they remember their old tanks. So one of the first WW2 tanks made by the Allies was the M3 Stuart. This was a very small, fast American tank made in 1941. It had well-made tracks, making the light tank go at a fast speed of 36 miles an hour. The main cannon on it was a 36mm main cannon, which was very small and had little firepower, but the tank used speed as its main advantage. But this tank was not made for heavy power, and to destroy other tanks and destroy buildings, it was more put on the recon role and troop support. And the Stuart tank still had a good weapon on it, but it couldn't take out big tanks as that's not what it was made for. The tank shot M44 bullets, and the armor was thin at only 2 inches thick. But what Allied tanks were battling were the Nazis. The most iconic Nazi tank was the Tiger I. This medium tank was insanely effective, shooting an 88mm bullet, which was extremely high power. And this tank had nearly 4-inch armor, which wasn't amazing, but good for World War II. It was also slower at only 28 miles an hour. The cannon on the Tiger shot armor-piercing rounds and high explosive rounds. This tank was more used for heavy power than speed. The turret speed on the first and earliest Tiger tanks was 360 degrees in 60 seconds. Now, to arguably the best tank of WW2, the Soviet T-34. This tank was the one thing that started to crumble the Nazis and guy who failed art school. The T-34 had a rounder turret with good protection on the tank. The tank was made in September of 1940. It could travel at speeds of 33 miles an hour, which is not bad for such a heavy tank. It had a 76mm cannon on it, shooting mainly frag HE rounds. The tank's armor thickness was at 2.5 inches or so. This tank was super effective though, as it was faster than the Tiger I and still had good firepower. Now, what tanks did our chaps in the UK have? The most Britishish and iconic UK tank was the good old Mark VI. This tank actually resembles a modern tank a fair amount, unlike the foul, disgusting, trapezoid-looking Mark I. This tank was kind of reliable in WW2 for being a Mark tank. The armor was not very thick at around only 1.6 centimeters, and the gun was kind of small at only 57 millimeters, as the Brits liked to be little ants and swarm the Nazi tanks with little infantry rifles. but the speed makes up for the lack in armor and firepower going at 36 miles an hour. But this tank had another problem. This tank's barrel stabilizer was horrible. An anthill would make it offset, probably. Now we go south to see the local Italian Baldi, Mussolini. Fascist Italy was more in entree, but they had one tiny tank, the L3. This tank was like a cardboard fort you'd make as a kid and use a Nerf gun to defend it. Or was that just me? But it's the same premise for the L3. Though this tank is very liked by everyone, it served little purpose in World War II. Even though this tank was tiny, it was still not very fast at only 26 miles an hour, and only shot machine guns with 8mm bullets. The armor was thin at around 1.3 inches only. This tank was in fact so tiny that the average little 9-year-old was a whole inch taller than it. That was a bad moment for Mussolini there. So, there are all the main World War II tanks. But the question you came here to find out, how do they compare to modern tanks? Are they better? Or just good for their time? Well, we will compare them to see. Starting in the US with the fuel-thirsty M1 Abrams. This tank is known for being a huge chunk of metal and guns being so heavy and huge. The Abrams can move regularly at 42 miles an hour. But the downside to these high speeds is it takes a huge 2.5 gallons of fuel per mile just to operate. But because the US raid every Middle Eastern country every chance they get, they have an insane amount. So that's why it's the main battle tank of the US. But why is this tank called the best modern tank? Because it's insanely engineered Chobham armor from our mates in the Britain land. This armor is so good because it uses metal and ceramic layers, and the layers are tilted in like a triangle shape for bullets to almost bounce or slide off, which is kind of does. This armor was first created for British tanks in the late 1960s, then used in the Abrams in the 70s when it was made. The M1 Abrams tank shoots a 105mm bullet with armor-piercing rounds as the main ammunition. The tank was said to perform in battle incredibly with high power and armor that no one could stop. Now to the Germans. In modern days have no Nazi-ness anymore, so they are with the Allies. So their main battle tank is the Leopard 2A6. This tank is liked by lots of people for being really good and because of the great German bias by some people. This tank can go at speeds of 45 miles an hour, the same as the M1 Abrams. The tank's armor uses the 3rd-gen composite armor, which is like Chobham armor. It has ceramic layers, steel plates, and fillers inside to make the bullet must go through a lot to kill the crew. The tank uses a 120mm smoothbore cannon, which is the same cannon type as the Abrams. But what makes the Leopard so good? Well, it's because this tank is insanely obese. Being over 12 feet long, that's 1.7 shacks laid out flat. So you know that's long. Because the tank's turret is so huge, enemies have no chance of breaking it as they have to fire all their rounds because it's so damn chucky. But this tank is great and works really well. Its treads are good and have great suspension on them for the tank. And the cannon is amazing and has high power on it. Now to the land of Central Sea to see the UK's main battle tank, the Challenger 2. The UK is really the big bang of tanks as we know them, so this tank should be good, right? The Challenger 2 travels at a kind of slow 38 miles an hour, which is almost the same as the M3 Stuart. But the armor makes up for it using the British Dorchester composite armor. This armor uses some explosive reactive armor and big plates and packs of armor. The tank also uses a 120mm tank cannon, which is kind of huge. The tank has a 7mm coaxial minigun and a top one with same bullet size. But one thing that makes this tank stand out is a built-in toilet under the loader's seat. I feel bad for the crew there. This tank has a lot of love and hate. Some people say it's so slow it's waiting to get hit, and others say the armor is amazing and the high firepower makes up for the loss. This tank is good but not amazing. So that's the Challenger 2 of the Brits. Now to the vodka-drinking bear hugging nuke-owning cold-loving motherland Russia. The main battle tank of Russia is the T-90mm. This tank was first heavily produced in 2017, which is really new. Newer than I'd think at least. This tank is speedy at 43 miles an hour. The tank weighs around 40 tons. This beast shoots a massive 125mm armor-piercing rounds using the smoothbore cannon. But wait, if you made it this far and like this video, then subscribe. It's good advice and the T-90M crews agrees probably. This tank's armor is the Russian explosive reactive Contact-5 armor. But how does it work? Well, the armor plates explode before the bullet can hit it, which destroys the bullet before it can hit the tank, which has been proven to be very effective against other tanks. But you know what the T-90M fears? Drones and Javelin anti-tank missiles. This is a great tank, but how the war in Ukraine has gotten to it. The T-90M has an autoloader, but they stored the ammo in the middle, and it's very exposed. So Ukraine has exploited that flaw, and when they hit it, the turret goes flying high into the air. I think Elon should start taking notes. But other than that, this tank is great. Amazing. So now to the pizza land, Italy. The main battle tank of modern Italy is the C-1 Ariete. This tank is God status in comparison to the L-3. This tank is fast at 40 miles an hour. The tank has a smoothbore cannon like everyone else and shoots 120mm bullets. Its armor is a mix between steel and composite armor. This armor is like the M1 Abrams in many ways. This tank is known to be really good, actually. Being made in the early 2000s, this tank has newer tech to it and armor, which makes it a great main battle tank for Italy. But this tank I don't hear much about when it's so good. But now, what you came here to find out, what's better, modern or World War II tanks? Well, many people make the argument that older tanks are better on how they performed, and saying that modern tanks are being blown up all the time. But on the other side of the debate, people say modern tanks are better, for better tech, armor, and almost everything. But who's right? Well, I think modern tanks are better. World War II tanks only had grenades, a bit of mines, guns, and other tanks to really worry about. But modern tanks have to fight missiles, fighter jets, drones, and way more stuff. So if you took 2 modern tanks to fight in World War II, they would be way stronger than older tanks. It's really just modern tanks have to overcome way more challenges. So that's what I think. But what do you think? Comment below and subscribe if you made it this far.